All right, so chapter 12, we talked about data, data collection, mean, median, mode, range, outliers, histograms on plotting our data, dot plots. So we're going to be going into chapter 13.1, which is really a lot easier because it's just, here's my graph and here's what I'm going to tell you about it. Now, I'm going to stand off to the side. I know it's been whiting it out when I stand in a certain area, and it seems like as I'm recording, if I stand right in front of the camera, it whites out my screen. I haven't found a setting that I can change that on. Hopefully the new computer that I get here within a week or two, I won't have that type of issue recording. So I'll just continue talking, and then you know, you'll see me pointing things out. So as we talk about dot plots, we know that we have an x-axis. It gives us our values that we're talking about, and then each of the dots that are recorded is one of the pieces of data that was collected. So when we look at this scenario that we're talking about Jacob. Jacob's going fishing, freshwater fish. I don't care what type of fish we're talking about in this dot plot. What I need to know is that there was one fish that was caught that was 5 inches long. There were 3 fish that were caught at 6 inches long. There was 2 fish caught at 7 inches long. So on and so forth. It records my data. Now when I look at it, then I also need to realize that over here, I have some directions that I need to follow. It says to circle any spaces with no data. So if I have anything up here that doesn't have any data collected, I have to circle it. So I have a big grouping there in the center. And then it says place a box around any groups of data. So I have 1 group and 2 groups where the data is indeed recorded. And then it gives me a new vocabulary word. I have a gap. Well, what is a gap? A gap is exactly what it sounds like. It's just an opening. It's a space where the data isn't recorded. So it asks, does the dot plot contain any gaps? If so, where? Well, it does. And the ones that it has is from 8 to 10. There's nothing recorded. There weren't any medium-sized fish that were caught. There were only smaller fish and larger fish. So my gap, my empty space, is going to be from 8 inches to 10 inches. Then it says, so there were no fish from where? Well, that's from the 8 to the 10 inches long. And there were 2 clusters of fish measuring from. But we have to figure out what a cluster is. And that's the second definition that's over here. So as I point, I'm trying to show you my shadow, by the way, just so you can figure out what I'm doing. So a cluster is a group of data points that lie within a small interval. So when I look at my image, then I have 3 here and I have 4 here. That would be considered a small interval. So I know that there were 2 clusters of fish measuring from 5 to 7 inches. So I fill it in. And there's 11 through 14. So 11 to 14 inches. So by the definition of clusters, a small group then, there is a cluster from 5 to 7 and 11 to 14. All I'm doing is looking at the dot plot and giving some basic information that I see. Well, I see there's a gap here, and I see there's a cluster here, and I see there's a cluster here, and I would just write that on my lines if I was supposed to be given a written answer. So let's look at the second one. When we talk about patterns, what do we see? Well, then I can also begin to talk about, well, with my patterns, I have a mode. What is my mode? Well, once again, a mode by definition just simply means the one that's up there the most. And I have 2 different numbers, 2 different locations with the same data value that was collected. Both 6 and 12 have a 3 in it. It's the highest number. It is my mode. So I could say, what patterns do I see? Well, I have clusters. I have a gap. I also have a mode that is repeated in each of my clusters. So scenario 2 then takes us to pumpkins. And in the pumpkins, then it shows us one of these patterns here. What is this called? It's not a bar graph, right? So that is a histogram because I have fat bars and there's no spaces in between. So if I have to draw a histogram, I have to draw it with fat bars that all touch and that are shaded in showing the values. It says Erica made this histogram to show the weights of the pumpkins grown at her father's farm in October. What patterns do you see in the data? And then down below, it gives us the idea of what we're supposed to be talking about. They introduce us to the idea of, with histograms or with different data charts, symmetry. And we all know what symmetry is. We talked about symmetry before Christmas break when we talked about shapes. It's where if I divide something in the center, it looks the same or very similar to on both sides. So then my thinking pattern then, we go just piece by piece. Identify any peaks of the data. And the peak is the highest point. It says the histogram has blank peaks. Well, it only has one. The interval representing the greatest number of pumpkins is for weights between what? So when I talk about my peak, my highest number, then I look at my data chart. We're talking about weights in pounds. So I'm talking about between 21 and 30 pounds. Step 2 says describe how the data changes across the intervals. The number of pumpkins increases from blank to blank. Well, they tell me from 0 here. Well, what does it go to? Well, in increasing, I'm going all the way up to a 30 because that tells me it's a 30 right there. So I know I'm going to be increasing from 0 up to 30. And blank from 31 to 50. So if I go to the 31 and I go to the 50, what happens to my chart there? It simply decreases or it goes down. So once again, chapter 13, lesson 1 is just simply about, let's look at the data charts that we're given. It doesn't matter what type of chart they give me. And let's explain what I'm seeing. What kind of information can I get from it? What do I see here that I can answer and inform people about when it comes to these items? Then it says to describe any symmetry that the graph has. If I draw a vertical line through the interval for blank to blank pounds, the left and the right sides of the histograms are very close to being mirror images. The histogram blank symmetry. So let's do what it says. Let's draw a vertical line. Once again, vertical is up and down. Horizontal, like the horizon that we would see off in the distance, goes long ways. So if I draw the line of symmetry, the vertical line, it would go straight down the center where the peak is. Well, what's that measurement? That measurement, once again, for the peak is 21 to 30 pounds. The left side and the right side, are they identical? Well, this one actually goes a little bit higher than this one, but what it says is that they're very close to being mirror image. They don't have to be identical when it comes to data charts. So I know that the histogram does have, or has, a symmetry. If I divide it in the center, they're very similar one to another. So the data value increases to one peak in the interval for 21 to 30 pounds, and then it decreases. The data set has symmetry about the peak. So it's saying the peak, the highest point, when I divide it side by side, I have a very similar pattern on both sides of the symmetry. It does have symmetry to it. And when I look at this one then, I'm just going to answer the basic questions. If I look at this dot plot, what can I say about it? Don't make this difficult because it's not difficult at all. It's just, hey, tell me about what you're seeing. So the dot plot shows the number of painting students in the art club display at the art show. Does the dot plot contain any gaps? That's my first question. Well, if so, where? Well, it does have gaps. Between 5 and 6, there weren't any students that recorded that information. So I would say yes, between 5 and 6. Identify any clusters in the data. Well, I only have one cluster. Once again, it's a small interval grouping of information or data that was collected. So identify the clusters. Well, it's between 1 to 4. Summarize the information in the dot plot. So what can I say about this dot plot? Well, I could say that the majority of the students displayed artwork between 1 to 4 pieces of art. I could also say the mode was one piece. How often did it happen? It happened 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I could also say what we talked about last week, there was an outlier, something that was far away from all the groupings or the main cluster of information. So the outlier would be 7 pieces. So everyone in the class displayed anywhere from 1 to 4 pieces of art, but we had an overachiever who actually did 7 pieces and put them on display. Going on. Now I have a histogram. What patterns do you see in this histogram? This is very basic and very simple. I don't have any major numbers. I just have to look at it and explain what I'm seeing. So what am I seeing? I think I have 4 different points up here that I included. So I could say there are 2 peaks in the data. Because when I talk about peaks, I'm talking about the cluster, and I have 1 cluster here, and I have 1 cluster here, and I see that I have a peak and a peak. So I could say I have 2 peaks in the data. I could say, well, there is a space, there's a gap between 30 and 39. No information or no data was collected. I could say the result decreases from 0, decreases, it should be decreases, my apologies, from 0 to 29. So when I go from here, going down, I have a decrease in value. I could also say the opposite of that then, that the results from 40 to 69 increases. It's just what am I seeing when I look at the data. There's not a right or wrong answer as long as you don't say something like there were 400 people between the ages of 30 and 39. That's an impossible answer. I don't get any of that information from the data. So it's just basic answering the questions. Or we could have, like this scenario, where they give me pieces of information and I have to just identify, is that a true or a false statement? So when I look at the information I have, we're talking about per game, I have all of these pieces of data that's collected. I don't really know what I'm talking about, so let's look at the scenario. The dot plot shows the number of errors made by a baseball team in the first 16 games of the season. So errors are when there's a mistake. You should have thrown the ball to second base, but you threw it to first base or third base. Or you had the ball in your hand, but it went underneath your glove and you didn't stop. It's just silly mistakes that happen, and they just record those type of things. So we could see that we had several games where we didn't have any errors. We had one really bad game where we had 6 errors throughout the game. So with that information, I just am going to answer yes or no. There is a gap from 4 to 5. When I look at it, notice 4 and 5, there is a gap. I would have to say, yes indeed, that is a true statement. There is a peak at 0. Peak, once again, is the highest point. I look at 0, that is the highest point, so I would say, yes indeed, that one is correct. The dot plot has symmetry. So once again, on my symmetry, I look at where my peak is, and then I look at both sides of it. Is there a symmetrical resemblance? No, there's not on that one. There are 2 modes. No, I don't have any numbers that are represented the same. 0 has the highest, 1 has 4, so I have no mode at all, do I? There is 1 cluster. Yes, indeed, there is 1 cluster to this data chart. The outlier would be the 6, but that's not asked. So I just know that that's a yes. So it's just identifying that these are factual statements or not. Once again, this is not a difficult lesson. This should be really easy and really quick, less than 15 minutes for the video. So I need you to take your time, watch it, make sure you understand, but don't make it hard. It just says, explain to me what you see in the chart. Tell me what you see in the chart. Is there a gap? Are there multiple gaps? Is there a mode? Is there an outlier? Is there a decrease of value? Is there an increase in value? Are there clusters, or is there one main cluster? Just identify that information and you'll be good to go on your assignment. So you have 2 through 6, and then on the back there's only 5 for this lesson, so there's 1 through 5. As you're working on it, come back and I'll answer questions while I work with other people. Now tomorrow's lesson is more difficult because it's all brand new information, so please come in tomorrow with an open mind that you're going to watch the entire video, no matter how long it is, so you can learn the new information that I'm going to teach.